Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know some people might not be able to join us tonight because of the power outages. My name is Tessa Posey. I'm the Membership and Database Manager here at the Figge Art Museum. We're so happy for you to join us this evening. We would like to thank you for joining us for this demonstration and question and answer session with Steve Sinner. We are so excited to celebrate the 15th anniversary with you. We wish to thank Trimble Family and Trimble Point Companies for sponsoring this event this evening. All proceeds from our 15th anniversary celebration go to support the Figge's art and education programs, enabling us to continue bringing art and people together at a time when our community needs us the most. If you would like to make a quick and easy anniversary gift to the museum, it is simple. You can give through our text to give feature. Text the word Figge to 844-844-6844, and we'll share that again at the end with you. If you have a question during this time, you could feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat feature, or to go ahead and use the raise your hand feature during the question and answer session, and we can pull you onto video if you'd like to ask Steve directly. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Michelle Hargrave, our Executive Director of the Figge Art Museum.
The lives of those in our region now and to help build a stronger tomorrow through art education and outreach programs at the museum, in our schools, in the community, and online through our virtual museum. The Figge offers 17 special exhibitions each year, bringing world-class artwork from all around the world to the Quad Cities. And we've amassed an impressive art collection of over 4,000 works of Mexican colonial, Haitian, European, and American art. As we develop the program in 15 days of our 15th anniversary, we created events that celebrate some of the highlights of our educational programming, exhibitions, acquisitions, and collaborations with artists over the years. We also looked ahead to our next major exhibition, For America, Paintings from the National Academy of Design, which will open on February 20th, 2021. This exhibition will tell the story of a developing America and American identity and the evolution of art and artists within our country through the oldest artists' honorary society in the US, the National Academy of Design. For America will consist of over 90 works by renowned American artists such as Frederick Edwin Church, Celia Bow, Winslow Homer, William Merritt Chase, John Singer Sargent, Andrew Wyeth, and many more. I am thankful to all of you for your support and for joining us tonight. I know you will enjoy this special program, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce Steve Sinner. Steve is a distinguished wood turner living and working in Bettendorf, Iowa. His wood-turned vessels are internationally recognized for their artistry, precision, and elegance. We thank Steve for joining us tonight, and we are first going to watch a studio tour that he has prepared for us.
To my studio in Bettendorf, Iowa. We're going to give you a little tour of the studio, and then we'll show you how we go about making wooden vessels like this one. Woodworking was an avocation until the mid-'80s when I began to concentrate on wood turning. I quit my day job in 1998 to take up turning full-time, and this studio with sunroom above was added to our home in 2001. Those logs are my basic materials. I've been working with wood since I was a young boy. My degree from Iowa State was in industrial education. Now, dust is a concern in both wood and metalworking, and I have a zero tolerance for dust particles small enough to float in the air, so the studio is equipped with a large dust collection system designed to trap dust at the point of creation. It ends up in those bags hanging back there. It's so effective that there's less of a dust problem here than there is in the rest of the house. The freezer is used to store wood for long periods, and it also is used to process freshly turned vessels to help them dry faster. This lathe is set up for hollowing, and we'll see how that works later. Around the corner here, we've got 3 grinders, and they have 6 wheels on them, each of which serves a specific function. Life is complex. I have one of my old lathes that I converted to an indexing lathe. So it serves a single purpose. It has a couple of stepper motors which can be precisely controlled. And here's an example of a small goblet. The piercing on that goblet was done on that lathe. Tool making requires cutting, machining, and welding steel. The machines in this area include a large milling machine, a small milling machine, and a metalworking lathe. There's another metalworking lathe and a TIG welder over by the door. The studio was originally built primarily for wood turning, and there was plenty of space. Early on, I began to improve and develop tools to do my work. That became another business when friends started to ask me to make similar tools for them. Now it's crowded in here due to the inclusion of a variety of metalworking machinery for tool making. I like to save stuff. I'm probably a borderline hoarder. The walls and even the ceilings are covered with reminders of where I've been. There are posters, gallery ads, name tags, and much more. So many places and so many friends, thereby remembered. This is a lathe we're going to be using for the demo later on. I've had it for more than 20 years. The largest lathe in this group is this one right here. It's actually made in Wisconsin. We put pieces on that to start with that weighed up to 610 pounds. There's a hoist and a track above these 2 lathes so that we can put heavy logs, lift them up with a hoist, and precisely locate them and mount them on the lathe. Now when we make vessels, we start out with wood that's freshly cut. We cut it today, turn it today, so it needs to be dried, and that's why you see all of these vessels hanging up in the rafters up there. They're all drying out, getting ready for their second turning. Also, we have a lot of odds and ends of things here, as I mentioned before. I do have an excuse, however, and this is it. No other comment necessary. But again, these things are a comfort. It's great to remember the people and the places and to kind of keep track of that sort of thing. And there are a lot of things up here that actually are failures. You know, I hung onto this stuff to remind me of what doesn't work. Well, that's enough for the tour. Let's get on with the demo. The lathe has a spindle that is turned by a motor, and on the end of that is this chuck. Now the chuck is basically a vise. It's just a circular vise that's mounted on the spindle. And what I just took out of there was called a spur center. It's removable so that you can use the chuck for other things. Now let's take a moment or two to look at some tools. This is called a roughing gouge. It's to remove wood very quickly. We also have a kind of a tool that's called a scraper. You'll see it's quite a bit different, but it also has a sharp edge on it, but it's flat. It doesn't cut the wood, it scrapes it. And then there are other gouges. This is would be called a bowl gouge. It's a deep fluted gouge, very, very sharp edge. You'll see this being used to put the external shape on the vessel here very shortly. The wood we have on the lathe right now is a piece of sugar maple or hard maple. The 4 woods that I really prefer to work with are maple, walnut, cherry, and hickory. Each one of them has a particular advantage. The hard maple we're working on here gives a nice clean surface for adding all kinds of graphics work. So it's a nice clean white canvas when it's done. Now we're setting the speed up here. We're going to use a roughing gouge, and you can see that no piece of wood as it comes from the tree is a nice neat cylinder. Unfortunately, we think of it that way, but it's not. So we're using the roughing gouge here, and we're beginning to turn it into a nice cylinder. You remember that spur center that we pulled out a little bit ago? That's back in the chuck there, and the spurs on that spur center have bit into the wood on that end, and on the other end, on the right end there's a ball bearing, what we call a live center. It's a cup center, and it has a little circular sharp edge that bites into that end of the wood. So the wood is driven by the spindle on the left side, and basically you just have an idler supporting it on the right end there. It kind of hammers at you a little bit here, as you can see, and right there it actually moved the tool rest a little bit, so I'm going to tighten that up and reset it, and we're going to go back to getting our cylinder made here. Sorry that I bumped the camera there. You'll see that happen a time or two. I'm actually wearing a face shield. When you're doing this, you may have noticed that a couple of times there were some pretty big chunks of bark that flew off of there. You never know where they're going to go, and they can be pretty dangerous. So kind of a hefty face shield is a good idea to wear when you're doing this. I'm also kind of standing off to the side of the lathe so that if anything comes off with very much force, hopefully it won't hit me. You can see there on the right end where there was a branch that offers some wood that's going to be of a different hardness as we work away at this. Now, as we get it turned down here, we're actually going to turn this around in the lathe and put the other end in the headstock, or in the spindle end after a bit. So what we need to do here, since we know this is going to be the bottom of the vessel now because of that branch that was in there, we're going to turn that down so that it will fit in the chuck, and ultimately we'll grab that end of the vessel in the chuck. So we're just getting rid of a lot of wood there, and there you can see my face shield. So now you notice that the end of the vessel is wobbly. It's not been cleaned off perpendicular to the axis of the lathe. So we're going to do that right now. We're going to take that gouge, we're going to kind of even this out a little bit and refine it, get it down to the right diameter, and then we're going to cut across the end of that and make it square to the axis of the lathe, so that if we stood this up on end, once we've done this, it'll stand straight up and down. Once we get that planed off, we're going to take a special scraper here. Check that. Yeah, it looks good. I think we can go ahead with that. We're going to use a special scraper now, and we'll actually create a little dovetail on the bottom of there once we get the diameter correct. The dovetail will actually match the chuck jaws. Probably wasn't really obvious when we showed you the chuck earlier, but the jaws in the chuck are tapered so that they have a dovetail shape to them. And here we go, we're putting the dovetail on the end of the vessel. Now that's ultimately right exactly where the vessel will be placed into the chuck. That's the part that the chuck will grab onto. And now we need to define where the bottom of the vessel will actually be. So we're going to turn a tang down here using another specialized scraper. And we go in here, and from here on out, when we reverse this, the piece will be driven by that thin little tang ultimately, and we're going to refine that a bit with another scraper. We're going to make that round because those sharp edges constitute a stress riser, and a stress riser is a weak point that can cause the vessel to fail as you're turning it later on. So now as we finish this this little foot and tang up here, we'll pull it off the lathe, and there's a little bit of a nubbin there where the live center ran, and we're going to take that off. We'll use a little reciprocating saw here to do that. Buzz that off of there, and once we've got that done, we want to put the date on it. Remember, this is green or wet wood. This is freshly cut wood, so it has to dry, and we don't want it to dry too quickly. So we want to know, once we hang it up, we like to know what the date was that we turned it, or at least the month. This was last month there, when I actually shot the video. So right now we'll put a little anchor, what's called anchor seal. It's a brand name of the product. It's an emulsion of wax and water, and as that dries, it'll just leave a wax surface there, and that will retard the moisture from escaping that end grain, slow it down. The problem with drying wood is if it doesn't dry evenly, it creates stresses, and then it'll crack and break. So you try to create a situation that'll allow the wood to dry evenly all the way through. Now we've mounted it in the chuck. We put the foot in the chuck. We brought the tailstock, that's a tailstock, up with a live center on it, and we're tightening down that chuck now. Remember, that's a rotary vise holding the piece, going to drive the piece. And our cylinder still has a little bark on it there, and notice it runs out a little bit. It's not exactly round yet, and we expected that. And now we've got it remounted in the form that it's going to be. And remember, now we put the bottom on the left, and the top of the vessel is going to be on the right. We're going back to that roughing gouge, and we're going to take a little bit of that wood off there and get the rest of the bark off. And as soon as we've got that kind of smoothed out a little bit with the roughing gouge like that, we're going to use the roughing gouge in a different manner. The tool rest there that the gouge gets rested against is going to be lined up. Now I'm sighting down across the tool rest onto the ways, what we call a ways, the bed of the lathe, and I'm going to make that tool rest so that it is exactly parallel with the axis of the lathe. So that gives me a guide now, and I'm going to use my roughing gouge in a kind of a shearing motion, and I'm going to very carefully plane off a section of the wood here that is going to be as exactly parallel to the axis of the lathe as I can get it. The reason for that is that we're going to put some wheel tracks on here, and later on when we take this over and start hollowing it, there's going to be a device called a center steady that has wheels on it, and these wheels are going to run against that track. I'm creating that track right now. So that is just a temporary device that's, remember, parallel to the axis of the lathe, and is going to be the place where the wheels ride when they support the piece for hollowing. Now we go back to roughing the shape, get the bottom side, just get a lot of the extra wood out of there. We're not worried too much about shape when we're doing the roughing. Now we're going up the top. We're going to do the same up here. Take a lot of excess wood off. Roughing gouge allows us to make some big changes in a hurry. They're not precise at all. We just want to kind of like get rid of the excess wood so that we can get on with the precision. Now the top, just like we did the bottom, the top is going to have to be planed off again to make it flat and square with the world, and that's what we're doing right now. And then we can proceed to get the shape that we want on the top. Now this is where things really get interesting. You don't see a big difference that's going on here now, but what's really important through this next few minutes here is that we get this shape just exactly right. Line and form are where everything is. Now we're creating the rim. We've decided where the top of the vessel is. Now we've decided where the rim, how big the rim is going to be, and we're getting rid of some of the excess wood here. And then we're going to change over back to scraper. The scraper we showed you earlier, it's got a kind of an unusual shape on the end of it, but the shape from the rim down to across the shoulder and into the widest part of the vessel that particular shape on every single one of my vessels is the same, and it's a signature element of my work. So I need to be really, really careful and precise as I do this. And I'm not looking at the cutting tool. I get the cutting tool in position, but then I start looking up at the top of the vessel. And if you look up at the top, you can see the shape develop. And you can see it much more clearly than you can see it in the bottom. So as I do this, that's where I'm looking. And I'm looking for that particular shape. And I haven't got it there yet. It's going to have to go a lot more. Yeah, there we go. That's better. No, a little more yet. Yep, a little more. A little more. And then we need to refine that just a bit from the wheel track on down and get the shoulder of the vessel just exactly right. And to do some precise work, we can take the gouge like this on its side and kind of use it as a scraper and take off little teeny tiny amounts to get the shape where we need it. Now the top looks okay, so now we got to do the bottom of the vessel, and we're just going to take a quick cut across there and start working toward our final shape. And again, I'd be looking up at the top of the vessel there, and I'm evaluating the diameters, the relative diameters, the rim, the neck, the widest part of the vessel, and the bottom. How they relate to each other is extremely important in the final appearance of the vessel. And remember, again, line and form are extremely important, and this is the most critical part right here that we're doing. It's very, very difficult to get these curves just exactly right. And no matter how hard we try, as a general rule, when the piece is all done, when it's finally set up on its own, complete, finished and everything else, I can usually say probably about 1 out of 10 I can sit back and say, yeah, I got that one just exactly the way I wanted it to be. So that's just an indication of exactly how difficult it is to do that. And we're going to round this bottom a little bit here. I'm going to plane off the bottom, make it square again, and then round it off right there. A vessel that sits flat on a surface that doesn't have that little bit of a rounding off on the edge of it looks like it's planted there. It looks like it's glued to the surface. I don't particularly care for that appearance, so I always like to round it off a little bit. So it's looking pretty good. I think we can go ahead with this now. We'll take it out of the lathe and move the tailstock away and open the chuck up, take it out, and we'll be taking it over to the other lathe that we have set up for hollowing. Now let's take a closer look at the hollowing setup. This is a boring bar. It rests in a trap on the right end there and a nose support on the left end. And then the piece, the vessel, is held by what we call a center steady. That's the device with 3 wheels. Now I'm using, for the purposes of the demonstration here, this is a vessel that's already been hollowed just so you can see how this works. You swing the end of the bar, and there's a guide pin there on the nose support, and as you swing the end you can control the depth of cut. The camera makes the laser dot look like it's a lot bigger than it is. You set the dot at a distance that you want the thickness of the wall to be, and that way when the laser turns to a line on the outside of the vessel, you know that the cutter is that distance away on the inside, and you know that you have exactly the right thickness. The cutter is made in New Zealand. It's carbide, it's razor sharp, it has a little guard over the top. It can be adjusted for the depth of cut, and you can also swivel it so that the angle of attack can be controlled as you need to have it. So let's mount our piece in the hollowing rig now. We put it in the chuck again using that same foot that we used before, and we're going to tighten it down, and then we'll move the center steady to a position so that the wheels line up with the wheel track that we created earlier, and then we'll tighten that down and bring in the wheels. First the front, and a little bit of run out. We'll correct that. Then we bring up the back wheel, and then we bring down the top one. I make those wheels, I make the center steadies, I make the supports, I make the boring bars, make tool rests, all of that stuff. And now we'll move the nose support up to where it's ready. Now I pulled a switcheroo here. I put a piece of scrap into the lathe. The problem with showing you hollowing on a vessel is you can't see what's going on in there. So this will be a wide open piece and you'll be able to tell. We're going to start out by putting a little divot in here, and we're going to use that to center a Forstner drill bit that we'll use to drill out the center. And we drill out the center rather than turning it with gouges because it's such a slow process, because the wood is really not moving very fast in the center there, so it's slow. So now we're ready to drill it. Now we've mounted the Forstner bit in the end of the boring bar, and we've got our little divot there that'll help us center it, and as we push it in here, we'll just remove the center of this piece. We drill that out, and we have to retract it every once in a while to bring those shavings out of there. If you don't do that, they get hot, they expand, and you lose your bit in there, and then you have to cut the whole piece apart to get it back. So we just drill the center out. If we were doing this on a real vessel, we'd mark the depth on the top of that bar so we know when we got in far enough. And now you can see how the hollowing tool works. It's pretty efficient. It doesn't take too long, of course. We turn the speed up here and it'll go a little bit faster. But you can see that even on a large vessel, we can get the interior turned out of it fairly quickly. So you get the idea of how we go about making a hollow vessel. Now what we're going to do after that is we're going to hang this thing up, we're going to coat it with anchor seal, we're going to hang it up to dry. And when it's dry, we're basically going to go back through that entire process all over again and turn it a second time, because it will have moved when it dried. It won't. It will no longer be round. But once we've done it the second time, we'll have a vessel like this, which is nice and smooth and plain and all ready to do whatever we'd like to do with it. And we'll talk about some of those things now. I consider the Ant Farm series to be my signature works. This is the fourth in the series and was created as a commission for the Museum of Nebraska Art. The Figge owns Ant Farm 3. Let's take a look at what it takes to apply the graphic to one of these. To begin with, we coat the entire piece with some spray-on masking material, and we can lay out the pattern on that masking. The ants will be in cubicles, so we've put a grid on the piece, and we're determining where the cubicles will be and where the walls of cubicles will be. The walls are going to be red, so we pull away the masking where we're going to airbrush the color of the wall. When all the airbrushing is complete, we remove the rest of the masking. We'll apply a couple of coats of finish and we'll spray on another coat of mask. Now we'll cut out the mask from the floors of the cubicles and we'll apply gold and silver leaf. The ants are actually going to be patina created on silver chemically, and in order to do that we're going to have a lot of ants cut out of paper. Each ant has to be proportional to the size of the cubicle in which it is placed, so we need a lot of different sizes of ants. I used to have to cut the ants out of copy paper with an X-Acto knife, but now I have a friend with a laser, and this is the way to make ants. The chemical is placed on the paper with an insulin syringe, and it takes about 45 minutes for each one of the ants to develop. When all the ants have been completed, the masking is removed. The vessel is now ready for a couple of coats of finish that will be placed on there and sanded back in order to begin drawing the lines. We're back on that indexing lathe again, and now we're drawing what will be vertical lines on the piece using a technical pen on a sled. Horizontal lines are drawn on the piece using a technical pen in a ball bearing holder that I built. The addition of the lines changes the appearance of the piece quite a bit, and it's almost ready now for a couple coats of finish again. Now we've got some finish on the piece, and you can see that there is one cubicle with a gold floor, and all of the ants on the piece are facing that one particular cubicle, and they have no way to get out of their own cubicles. Another signature element of my work is the gold leaf rim, and that's being applied in this photograph. Well, that's it. The piece is complete. All that remains to be done is to cut the foot off the bottom and to sign and date it, and it'll be ready to be shipped off to the Museum of Nebraska Art. I do other work besides vessels. This piece is called Red Pipe. It's about 6 inches long and about a ½ millimeter thick. It's a suspended kinetic sculpture. Here's another thin cylinder that's been pierced. This one's about 9 inches tall, about 3 inches in diameter, and again it's about a ½ millimeter thick. Here's one of a couple of pieces I've done that I call the Hedgehog series. This one's got several thousand little bugle beads in it. These are fun to do. I want to do some more. Most of the work I do these days are collaborations, primarily with Joe Merhage from Orion, Illinois. This particular piece is one of the series of metallic finishes that we like to mess with. We like to experiment with a lot of surface finishes. Here's a close-up shot of what this one looks like. Here's another example of an experiment by Joe and I. It was Joe's idea to make this piece look like an old brass riveted vessel. Joe and I collaborated with George Olson to do this piece. It was donated to the Figge for the gala last year. Katie Kiley and I collaborated on this piece. It's all about a little fishing village in Mexico. She drew the ink drawings right on the piece. Here's one with Rafael Iacarino, another prominent Davenport artist. Joel Franken's design. This was another collaboration for charity. Donna Zills Banfield of New Hampshire is emerging artist in the wood turning field, and this was one we did together. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful presentation. We're now going to begin our question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand feature. Otherwise, we're going to be pulling them out of the chat here. Let's start with our first one. So, Steve, how do you know when the wood is ready and cured so it doesn't crack?
I use a moisture meter. It's called a pinless moisture meter. So it uses, I'm assuming it's a radio frequency of some sort of, that it sends into the wood and it measures the reflections. So when it gets down to around 8 to 11% on that meter, I know that it's actually dry and has reached equilibrium moisture content. That's ready to go.
Then another one we have here is, how do you get the curvature on the inside of the vessels to the right thickness that you want without puncturing through the vessel itself?
Well, we showed that. Actually, we used that laser. Maybe that wasn't very clear. The laser is set so that it projects a beam down right next to the cutter. And you can set the distance of the laser beam from the cutter. And as you work your way on the inside of the vessel toward the outside, removing material, when that laser beam becomes a line, a thin line on the outside of the vessel, you know, if you go any further, the laser beam is going to disappear, and the next thing you are going to see is the cutter coming through the side of the vessel. So you stop there, and you know that you have the right thickness.
Okay, and then we did see how you placed intricate designs onto the vessel. How do you go about deciding what medium to use to place on the vessel? Like, what does the wood take best?
I really like acrylics. My choice of materials is determined quite a bit by safety. There basically are two ways to go. You can go with the automotive materials, which are lacquers, and their solvent bases are pretty dangerous to inhale, and they're also really flammable. So you need to have some pretty highly specialized equipment to use them safely. Instead, I use the acrylics, which are water-based. They don't have those dangerous solvents involved, and they're not flammable. They're probably not quite as brilliant, and probably not quite as fancy as the automotive ones. Obviously, if that weren't true, you would be buying an automobile with golden acrylic paint on it rather than DuPont's whatever. But those have a bearing on the decision, and a lot of the effects can be obtained with either system. It's just a matter of a pretty small difference in degree in the final analysis.
Okay, this one comes from Amy. She asks, how often do you get into a piece of wood and find that it's not usable for the piece that you're trying to create?
Way too often. Once a year would be too often, but actually, as a percentage, I would probably say we need to toss about probably 10% of the stuff we start out with. And we were very careful when we like right now, if I were to drive around the Quad Cities with the storm we just had, I could have my choice of all kinds of wood and just pick it up off the curb. And what I would look for would be a piece of wood that has the pith or the center is centered as precisely as possible into the center of the wood, and with all the growth rings as concentric as possible. If the wood comes from a branch that leans off to the side, then it's got to be thicker either on the top or the bottom, depending on if it's a coniferous or a deciduous wood, and that's called reaction wood. And the stresses in that piece are going to be quite different from one side to the other. So when you turn it, rather than drying into a round form, it's going to dry into an oval shape. And in order to compensate for that, you have to leave it much thicker, which means that you're going to have a lot more loss to cracking, and it's going to take a heck of a lot longer for it to dry. Does that answer the question, or it seems to me there was another part there?
I believe that answered the question there. And then, so we have the next one. It says, does the cutter heat the wood to where it can actually end up burning the wood?
No, it does not. The wood is very efficiently cut away, and I've never burned. If you burn the wood, that means the tool is not sharp.
We do have a comment here from Wynn Schaefer, and she's offering up any sugar maple chunks that you may want. She has some of those.
I'll be over tomorrow, Wynn.
And then someone would like to know, has COVID impacted any collaborations that you have in the works currently?
Yeah, that shut down starting in March, of course, like with everybody. Joe and I, before that, for the last, I don't know, it's been many, many years, I think 10 or more years, we've been working practically one day a week. And we have not had a single day since COVID started. So that's shut that down. And, at first, the tool business kind of slumped off, which you would expect. So I was having time to make art and was really enjoying it. And after 2 or 3 weeks, I have no idea what the heck happened, but the tool business has just turned entirely around and gone bonkers. And now I've had very little time to work on the art, unfortunately.
Their follow-up question to that is, what are you excited to start on next?
Oh, gosh. That's a difficult one. I really don't know. It's kind of like whatever the muse comes through with when I step into the studio, and there is no single project in my mind right now that I'm anxious to get on with, or I'd probably throw everything else out and just start on it and say the heck with everything else. But so when I do have time, when that time does arrive, and I step down there and say, I can do anything I want, what's it going to be? It's hard to say because there are so many things. It'll just kind of depend on what comes in front of my eyes first, I suppose.
And then we have another comment. So from Barb and Eric Trimble from Trimble Point over in Moline, they said that they love having and are proud to display many of your pieces at Trimble Point. And then Michelle, our wonderful executive director, would like to know if you had any resource you wanted at your disposal, what would be your dream project?
Oh, golly, I suppose my dream projects are something on the order of the piece that Katie Kiley and I did together, and I'd love to do some more of those. That particular piece that we showed a while ago was the most expensive one that I've ever worked on. That's in a collection in the Napa Valley, California. And if I mention the name of the collector, I'm sure that Michelle would recognize it. They have a very famous collection, and it's pretty gratifying to be in a place like that. And by the way, you mentioned the Trimbles. Thank you, Trimbles, for sponsoring tonight. Appreciate that.
Okay, and then Richard Vermeer would like to know, how do you know that no one has ever put a nail or piece of metal into the wood before you start working on it?
Sometimes you can, if there's metal in the wood, a lot of times when you cut the tree or cut through the stump or the trunk or the branch or something like that, you'll see a blue color in the wood, and that'll tell you there's metal in there. But that doesn't always happen. That is usually with ferrous metals. And if you have something in there like a bullet that may be lead, you're not going to know until you hit it. And I think every wood turner at some point along the line has run into a screw or a nail or a bullet or some other thing like that in the wood. And you don't always know. Sometimes there's a stain and you're looking for it, but sometimes it's just, oh man, there went the edge of that gouge, you know. So.
Are there any artist friends that you haven't yet worked with but hope to?
Oh, yeah, I would say probably no fewer than a couple hundred. So, a lot.
Are there any global artists that you haven't met in person but would love to work with someday, and why?
You know, here's the thing. I showed a picture of a vessel that I work with an emerging artist, Donna Zills Banfield. And when that occurs, I'd approach him, you know. In Donna's case, I noticed her work, and it was obvious to me and a few other people that she was an up-and-coming artist. She had a different take. She had a great taste and ability. And in the years since I'd like to think that my asking her to collaborate kind of helped her along a little bit. I don't really know. How are you ever going to know that? But to answer the question, if that existed, I would approach them and ask them. So, you know, it's really pretty doggone easy. The wood turning community, as probably the newest genre of art on the planet, is only about 40 or so years old. And 40 years sounds like a lot of time now, but in the history of art, 40 years is nothing, absolutely nothing. And we're just beginning. And I don't know how many people know this, but the Figge has a fairly decent collection of wood art that a Chicago collector donated to them. And there's another collector from New York City that has willed a fantastic collection to the Figge, which they will be receiving here in the next 2-3 years. I'm not sure exactly how that is structured, but the Figge is probably going to be one of the few museums in the world that will have a really in-depth collection of the early artists, the work of the early artists in the genre of wood art.
Okay, and then what part of the whole process is your favorite to work on, and then which is the most tedious?
Well, they're one and the same. the part that I showed you, like making patina on silver and doing intricate lines and spaces and piercings, things like that, those are a lot of fun. And they're not the part that I showed you, the demonstration, you know, that's the part you got to go through to get where you want to be. That's kind of like putting preparing the canvas for the paint sort of thing, you know. And then when you get into actually doing the graphics, whatever they may be, if they're negative space, positive space, paint, ink, piercing, whatever it is, that's when the real fun begins. And we didn't show a lot of the really thin pierce pieces, but one of the things that's fun to do there is to develop an algorithm. So you have the choices of sizes of piercings, for example, and how they're spaced and their relative position to each other. And you can determine all those things in advance and set out and execute the algorithm. And the cool thing is you really don't know for sure what it's going to look like until you've completed one complete iteration and you get the full pattern. And that's really fun because sometimes it's just awesome. Sometimes it's like, but that's kind of the exciting part of going about that.
Are there any techniques that you would want to try that you have not yet used?
Always. The little sign that I showed there that said, you know, creative people don't have a mess, they just have ideas lying around everywhere. That's really, it's not just trite, it's true. There are so many things I want to do, you know, and I'm getting kind of old, so I'm getting beyond the point where I can have much hope of even getting a small percentage of them done, but there's no end to what I want to do and what I want to try. Never get there.
And then about how many layers of gloss or lacquer do you put onto each piece before it's complete?
That's a good question, and you know, the smart-ass answer is as many as it takes. In some woods and in some cases, you may get by with as few as 2. That would be unusual. But a lot of those pieces, like an ant farm, for example, it requires repeated. You do, you know, you do some work on it, and then you have to build up 1 or 2 or 3 coats of finish, sand it back, and do something else, and then build up some more coats. And one of the reasons we do that is because it's so much work. For example, to put the original color on the piece, that you want to be sure you have enough coats between that and the next process, so that if you screw up the next process, you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning, but you have enough of a layer there that you can just go back to the point where you can start this next layer over again, if that makes any sense. And then on the piece, for example, the piece that's in the auction, I put the final coat on that piece 3 or 4 times, I believe it was, and I put the final coat on as many as 5 times. And the reason for that is that final coat has got to be perfect. You can't have a skip anywhere. If the urethane is a day older than it should be, you're going to have ridges. It will not flatten like it should, and all you can do is sand it off and put on another coat. Now, with somebody mentioned lacquer. If I were using lacquer is a whole different animal. When you spray on a coat of lacquer over a coat of lacquer, you don't have to sand the last one to begin with, because chemically, the solvent in the new coat will soften the old coat and it will bond together and become one. With urethanes, that doesn't happen. If I would take a coat of urethane and on one of those vessels and not sand it and just put another coat of urethane on it, I would be able to, when that coat dried, I would be able to peel it off, right off of the coat underneath it. There is no chemical bonding. The bonding is mechanical, and if you leave any of the gloss on from the last coat, then it's not going to bond. And I learned that, by the way, at the Smithsonian Institution at the Lacquer Conservation Lab, which was one of the neatest places I've ever been, and one of the most valuable learning experiences I've ever had. Those people are, they are just absolutely incredible. And they're involved with determining how each piece that the Smithsonian owns is stored, how it's displayed, how often it can be displayed, what kind of lighting is used when it's displayed, and on and on and on and on. And they have things like electron microscopes and all sorts of neat tools to determine that. So there are more stories I could tell just about the Lacquer Conservation Lab that are pretty cool, but yeah, we don't have that much time.
And then we have a question that says, for the more intricate and detailed pieces, how long does the entire process take from start to finish?
Well, it can take something like an ant farm vessel. I do believe the ant farm vessel that I did for the Museum of Nebraska Art, I think I worked on that for about 3 years. But that doesn't mean I was working on it every day for 3 years. You know, what it may take today to work on a vessel may be 15 minutes. And then when we get to a different process, that may take a day and a half to complete that. And then the next process may be 15 minutes, but there may be drying times of a day or more in between. In the case of that particular commission, there was no rush. There was no time limit on it. So I was just doing it in spare time when I really didn't have much else that I needed to get done. So then I worked on that particular piece, and it took a long time, too long, but they've got it, so they're happy.
When you look at a new log, do you see what the finished piece will look like in your imagination?
I certainly do try. However, the wood can certainly surprise you, and you're never certain. You never know for sure what's going to be on the inside. Things happen to trees. If they're in a windstorm like the one we had recently, probably most of the trees that were in the path of that storm now, if they survived it, they're quite likely to have what are called wind shakes. When a tree bends to a certain point, at the place where two growth rings are next to each other, when it moves, you know, it bends over, that may just kind of slip like that. And as the tree goes back, it'll be back in alignment, but that crack is still there. So you'll start turning on a piece of wood, and then you run into this place where you've got two pieces of wood instead of one piece of wood. So those are called shakes. So that's something you can run into. And bark inclusions are another thing. Wherever there was at one time a branch, and as we all know, the tree starts out, you know, this tall and ends up 60, 80, 100 feet. And during that entire growth process, it's been shooting off these limbs that break off at some point and get grown over. And wherever they were grown over, that little bit that was in there before is what we call usually a bark inclusion, and it can be a flaw. So you need to be concerned about that too when you go into a piece of wood. I always tell, when I teach, I always tell my students, don't be seduced by the wood. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, because people have a piece of wood and they think, boy, it's you know, it's some sort of magical thing and I've got to finish it no matter what. And then they run into a flaw, and then they try to work themselves around the flaw. And by the time they work themselves around the flaw, they've got the shape screwed up and you can't get it back right. And you end up with something that you may have finished up, but is, you know, shape is bad and it's basically a piece of junk.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions here. So what is your favorite wood to work with, and what is your least favorite wood to work with?
Well, Win Schaefer said sugar maple, hard maple, sugar maple. I love it. It's the most difficult wood for us to get for several reasons. You know, we're not in the Northlands where a lot of hard maple grows in the woodlands, where it grows nice and straight and even. We get it from in town where it branches out every which way and does this and that and another thing, so it's very difficult to find a good piece of wood. If Wynn's got a full-grown hard maple tree that's on the ground, and if I go over there, and if she would allow me to select pieces out there out of that tree, out of it, one entire tree, I probably would not have more pieces than I could fit in my SUV comfortably. So that gives you an idea. And you're talking about several dump truck loads of tree. So we're really, really specific and careful about how we choose the wood.
Okay, and then I think the last question we're going to take here is, do you use any computer-aided graphic modeling?
I use computers for some things. For example, when I do those pierce vessels, I may work out an algorithm and use that to control the process. But as a general rule, not a lot. No, and it's not because I have any problem with that, because I think that computers are just as valid a tool for art as a brush and a pen. A lot of people say, oh, you use a computer. The only difference between CAD/CAM and manual stuff is the ability to duplicate. But if you use computer-aided design, for example, to create one piece, it's an original. One of the problems we have that distinguishes us from other artists is that I guess you can see behind me, that happens to be an original Yacarino. But Ralph can go and get giclées made of that piece. And, you know, it takes an expert to tell the difference between the two. There are no giclées for my work. So, you know, I make one, it's only one, that's it.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I wanted to remind everybody that we have a beautiful work of Steve's ready for auction, and that's a Florida rosewood that he turned exclusively for this auction. This piece plus many others are available for bidding. We have a DDA William and Ellen Wagner, Tim Schiffer, and many others, and they will be available for bidding until August 21st at 10 p.m. We're going to go ahead and include a link for that down in the chat. We hope that you continue to join us for many of our other wonderful events during our 15-day celebration for our 15th anniversary. We have a variety of events coming up, like a hand-blown glass demonstration by Hot Glass, an online tour of the John Deere art collection, a Caribbean cooking class, and much more. You can also support our mission by donating today, and your gift will be matched dollar for dollar thanks to Thomas K. and Jennifer Figge up to $5,000. So, and you can also go to our social media and website for more and how to be a part of the fun. And we want to thank you all for attending tonight. I'm going to go ahead and post all those links down into the chat here for you. We have a couple messages thanking Steve for his time. Thank you so much again.